A cold case dating back nearly a half-century appears to have been cracked this week.
They've shed tears, they've had sleepless nights, hoping one day an arrest would be made, and finally yesterday it was made.
Lindy Sue Biechler was 19 when her life was brutally taken away from her 46 years ago in the sanctity of her own home.
Several family members were in the courtroom as he pled guilty to charges of third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary.
But to understand why this case remained unsolved for nearly half a century, we have to go back to the winter of 1975. At just 19 years old, Lindy Sue Biechler was beginning a new chapter of her life. She had recently married, was building a future with her husband, and dreamed of opening a flower shop of her own. To her family and friends, Lindy was kind, hard-working, and full of optimism. She had no reason to believe that one ordinary Friday evening would become the last night of her life. What happened inside her small apartment shocked even experienced investigators. The crime scene was so brutal that it would haunt those who saw it for years. Yet, despite the violence, the killer seemed to vanish. Detectives chased hundreds of leads. They interviewed countless people. But every promising lead eventually came to a dead end. And the most disturbing part was this. For decades, the man responsible was not far away. He was right there, living nearby, passing through the same community, hidden in plain sight. Only years later would investigators discover just how close he had been all along. But for Lindy Sue Biechler, time stood still in the winter of 1975. She would remain 19 years old forever. Just weeks before that tragic night, the peaceful life she had been building began to change. Lindy repeatedly told her family and friends that she felt like someone was watching her. More than once, she saw an unfamiliar man lingering outside the sliding glass door of her ground-floor apartment. The fear became so overwhelming that she no longer felt safe staying home alone. Worried about her safety, her family planned to stop by and stay with her that evening, but they arrived too late. On the evening of December 5th, 1975, Lindy left work and stopped to buy groceries, just as she had done many times before. She returned to apartment 104 on Klaus Drive sometime between 6:45 and 7:05 p.m. When her aunt and uncle arrived later that evening, the front door was unlocked. The groceries were still sitting on the table, as if she had only just walked in. But instead of seeing Lindy's smile, they walked into a nightmare. Blood in the entryway, blood on the floor, blood everywhere. Inside, Lindy was found with 19 stab wounds. The scene was so brutal that investigators immediately knew this was no random attack and no ordinary burglary. The killer had used 2 different knives. One of them had been taken from Lindy's own kitchen. He had stayed inside long enough to take one of her own knives and continue the attack. Without realizing it, he left behind crucial biological evidence. At the time, no one could have imagined that this single piece of evidence would one day identify her killer nearly half a century later. In 1975, the technology needed to identify a killer through DNA simply didn't exist yet. The evidence was carefully preserved. The case file remained open. But for decades, no one knew who the killer really was. Investigation expands. Detectives began where every investigation begins. They questioned Lindy's husband, her family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who had crossed paths with her in the days leading up to the murder. One by one, they were all cleared. As the investigation expanded, detectives interviewed more than 300 people. Every promising lead was pursued. Every theory was carefully examined. At one point, investigators even explored whether Lindy's murder could be connected to a serial killer operating in Florida. But once again, the evidence didn't support the theory. Another lead came to an end. Years turned into decades. The investigation eventually became a cold case. But Lindy's family refused to let her be forgotten. They never stopped searching for answers. Every advance in forensic science gave them renewed hope that the truth was still within reach. In 1989 and again in 1997, forensic experts were finally able to develop a DNA profile from the biological evidence collected at the scene. When that profile was entered into the FBI's CODIS database in 2000, investigators believed they might finally have a breakthrough. For the first time in years, there was real hope. But there was no match. The investigation had reached another dead end. Most families would have given up. Lindy's never did. For nearly half a century, the evidence had been waiting. Now, science was finally ready to listen.
After nearly half a century of dead ends, investigators finally got the breakthrough they had been waiting for. It wasn't a new witness. It wasn't a confession. It was a breakthrough in forensic science. In 2020, the biological evidence preserved from the 1975 crime scene was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, a laboratory specializing in genetic genealogy for cold case investigations. Instead of searching for the killer's name in a database, experts took a different approach. They searched for people who shared parts of his DNA, family by family, generation by generation. Piece by piece, the genetic trail came together. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore and her team eventually traced the DNA to a family with roots in the village of Gasparina in Calabria, southern Italy. From there, investigators compared family trees, birth records, court documents, and address histories. Eventually, one name stood out: David Vincent Sinopoli. The more detectives investigated him, the stronger the case became. He had once lived in the very same apartment building as Lindy, only a few steps from her front door. For decades, investigators believed the killer was familiar with the building. What they never expected was that he had been living almost right in front of them all along. To confirm their suspicions, detectives placed Sinopoli under surveillance. On February 11, 2022, they watched him throw away a coffee cup at the airport. Investigators recovered the cup. DNA from the coffee cup matched the biological evidence collected from Lindy's apartment in 1975. The results left no doubt. After 47 years, David Vincent Sinopoli was finally identified as Lindy Sue Biechler's killer. That's right. After 47 years, the man who murdered Lindy Sue Biechler was finally identified. His name was David Vincent Sinopoli. He wasn't a fugitive. He wasn't living under a false identity, and he wasn't hiding from the police. For decades, Sinopoli lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. He got married, raised 3 children, later became a grandfather to 9 grandchildren. He spent nearly his entire life in Lancaster County, surrounded by neighbors who never suspected the secret he had carried for almost half a century. To many people, he seemed polite, quiet, helpful, the kind of person no one would ever imagine capable of such a brutal crime. Perhaps the most unsettling part was that Sinopoli had never truly been far from the place where it all began. He had once lived in the very same apartment building as Lindy. He knew the layout. He knew the entrances. He knew the neighborhood. Investigators now believed that familiarity may have allowed him to commit the crime and leave without attracting attention. For 47 years, Sinopoli wasn't free because investigators had failed. He remained unidentified because the science simply wasn't ready. The evidence had been there from the very beginning. It just took decades for technology to reveal the truth. In the end, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a confession. It was the evidence that finally spoke. Justice served. On July 17, 2022, nearly 47 years after Lindy Sue Biechler was murdered, David Vincent Sinopoli was arrested without incident. For the first time in decades, Lindy's family finally had the answer they had been waiting for. But knowing the truth was only the beginning. In October 2023, Lindy's family came face to face with the man responsible for her murder. After nearly half a century of silence, there was finally accountability. Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. During the hearing, he offered an apology in court, but notably, he never directly apologized to Lindy's family or to her husband, Philip. For those who had spent nearly 5 decades searching for justice, his words changed nothing. The evidence had already spoken. The court sentenced David Vincent Sinopoli to 25 to 50 years in prison, the maximum sentence permitted under Pennsylvania law for a crime committed in 1975. At 68 years old, the sentence meant he would almost certainly spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Lindy's family, no sentence could ever erase nearly half a century of loss. But after 47 years, the questions had finally been answered. This case is a reminder that justice doesn't always arrive when we want it to. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it has to wait for science to catch up with the evidence that was there from the very beginning. And when that finally happens, the truth has nowhere left to hide.